Welcome to Rick's Scale Model Fix and the first part of a brand new video build. This time we're taking a look at the Hawk T1 from Italeri in 1/48 scale. So this is a re-release of Iteleri's 2008 kit with new updated decal sheet. So please go and take a look at the review I posted up on the channel a while back. In the meantime, we'll crack on with the build and make a start. So before we start any build, it's always a good idea to have a read or a flick through the instruction booklet. Just familiarise yourself with the build sequences and see if there's anything that you could do to improve the build sequence for yourself, make the fit easier or the kit easier to work with. So not surprisingly, stage one of this build is the ejector seats and cockpit tub. So we're just going to skip over that for a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at making up two complete fuselage halves by adding the intakes first. So just quickly going to snip these fuselage parts off the sprue. Put those to one side. And then we're going to build up the air intakes. So we need 24/8 and 23/8. So as ever, we're going to take our time and clean up the sprue attachment points. I'm just going to cut those off with a scalpel. And we're just very carefully just going to remove any raised edges or flash from the edge of the intake parts. And we're just going to do a dry fit to see how the parts go together. So just on camera, I've just pointed out and just got a little hole in the plastic there at the end of the knife blade, which is the location socket breaking through the upper surface of the plastic. So that's going to need a small amount of filler. So we'll just trim this back edge up. Again, a little quick swipe with a sanding stick. And we're just going to work out which is the best way to fit this. The fit is reasonably good, as we can see there. So we're only going to need a very small amount of Mr. Surfacer just to hide that seam when we're done. And that's what we're trying to do. And it's easier to work on that when you haven't got a cockpit sat in between. So we'll just glue these together. Just using Tamiya quick dry and extra thin, and we're just going to hold that in place. There are a couple of ejector pins on the inside of the intake, but in all fairness you're not going to really see in there unless you look up there with a torch once the model is completed. So once the parts are completely dry, we can just work out around the edge of the intake lip with a sanding stick just to remove the flash. Just going to add some on the inside. Just being careful not to make that hole in the top of the intake any worse. We're just going to put a dab of filler in there when we're done. And we'll set that aside to dry. And we're just going to repeat the same process for the port side. So again, just cleaning it up. Can't stress this enough, and I know I go on about it in all my builds, but it can cause you massive problems if you're not good with your cleaning up of parts, especially with some of the modern kits that are brought to the market. It can throw the fit out massively. So again, we're just going to check the fit, and here's a prime example. The fit of the parts there is not brilliant, and that is caused by the ever so small piece of plastic just on the mating surface there. So this is why we always dry fit, test fit. and just that simple act with a sanding stick, and we've got a perfect seam. A bit more Tamiya extra thin. The fit on this one's not as good as the other, so we're just going to tease it out and we're just going to press it down on the cutting mat just to make sure we have got a reasonable fit, which is escaping me at the moment with this one, so we might have to just do a bit of sanding. But nonetheless, when offered up to the airframe, the fit is quite reasonable there. So we'll just work the underside with the sanding stick once it's in place. So again, just getting a smaller skinny, just making sure that those mating surfaces are free of any blemishes or raised bits of plastic or mould scars, flash, anything like that. And then we're going to do the same to our intakes. And then we're going to offer the intake up and secure it in place. Now you can see the fit there is reasonable. So we're going to add this with a bit of super glue. Once we've got the correct alignment like we have there, we can just let that super glue bite. And then we can just nudge it up and close the gap. Now that gap is more than acceptable. We can now just work on the inside part. So what we're going to do is we're just going to put the super glue on this inside lip, and ever so carefully, so we don't push a bead of super glue out, we're just going to close that gap by pulling the fuselage up slightly. And then what that's done is it's now closed that gap, panel lines are lining up, and then all we've got is a dry seam to work with, and that'll probably just suffice with a blast over with a sanding stick and a small bead of Mr. Surfacer just to blend it in. So with using super glue we can start the remedial work and the working on the seams quite quickly. So all we're doing here now is just blending the two surfaces of the plastic together. We're not really taking any material away, we're just polishing. We're using a sponge so that we don't create flat point. We're just working on that intake seam. There is a panel line around the edge of the intake, so we don't really want to remove that. So we're just getting that wing root. And this is why sometimes this is a really good example of why we would work these parts of the fuselage first before we join them together, because it's a lot easier. If you imagine you have the leading edge of the wing in there and a cockpit in here, then working on this area is not going to be easy. And then when you start priming and filling and sanding, you're going to run the risk of getting all that dust and detritus into your freshly painted cockpit. And we're just going to sand the edge of this, the top lip of this intake. And then we had this seam that we just need to take care of on the underneath. So I'm just going to use a coarse grade sanding stick just to take the height out of that. And once we're level, I'm just going to come in with the sponge again just to finish off. Don't forget, this is just the first stage of the process of attaching the parts in place. So we're not looking for perfection at this time. However, the better results we get here, the less work we're going to need to do later on. So I'm just working that plastic. Panel lines are quite deep on this kit, so that's a good thing. And we just got a tiny bit of a lip there at the wing ring. Which is gone now. And then just on the undersurface, we're going to bring that up. So there we go, a few minutes, and we've got an intake on there. Certainly once the primers, coats and Mr. Surfaces all added to that, you're not going to tell the difference between that and the kit panel lines. What we can now do is just add a bead of Tamiya extra thin, and then we can put that to one side to dry. So we can repeat this process now on the port side. So join me back when I've done that, and we'll have a look at what's next on the list. So with those fuselage intakes set aside to dry, we're just going to leave those now until it's time to put the fuselage together and come back to it way later in the build. It's time to start looking at the instructions again. We're going to skip the seats. We'll have a look at those, but I might put some resin ones in. We'll have a look and see what they look like. So we need to start building this cockpit tub up. So we need the cockpit floor, the bulkhead, the instrument panels and the controls columns. And there's a little handy diagram there to make sure you've got everything in the right alignment. Some nice detail on the rear bulkhead. Plenty of raised rivets and what have you. That should look good once painted and given a wash. Back wall of that cockpit's going to be visible. Nice tight fit there as well. It's that tight it doesn't want to fit correctly. So again, checking our fit, making sure everything does work, because if that bulkhead isn't in alignment, it's not going to go in between the fuselage halves. The fuselage halves aren't going to join together, and then you're going to have some work with filling later on. So we're just making sure all these mating surfaces are flat, and then we'll have a look at this again. Does butt up, it's quite a tight fit, and then we're just going to check that in our fuselage section. It does fit in, everything lines up. It's a bit sloppy, but it all fits, I think, in there. Just try and close those fuselage sections around them just to make sure. Sometimes a nice trick is just to glue one side in place. I've just put my fingers in the filler. Just put, everything looks good in there, it fit, everything's in alignment, so that's fine. So it's just having some slight fit issues with the cockpit tub. So what I've done is I've got everything in place within the fuselage now. It's just taped together. And with that in place, I've managed to put in the instrument panels and making sure that everything lines up. And just to make sure I've got the correct width of the cockpit tub and not forced anything out, I've just quickly gone and got the rear deck, or the rear coaming, off the sprue, and that'll just slot in over that instrument panel perfectly, so I know that everything is in the right sort of areas. And then we can take that out once the glue's dried and paint the cockpit up. So you join me back at the cutting mat, and I've just managed to get the fuselage front sections sprayed up, a little bit of Tamiya smoke and Tamiya panel line wash just to bring out that sidewall detail. And then I've had a look at fitting some of the photo etch parts from the Edad set FE430, and these were truly a nightmare. The cockpit appears to be very, very undersized and very thin in terms of sidewalls and instrument panels. Edad would have you laminate the two etch frets together and simply bend some tabs at the bottom to stick those into the cockpit tub and to replace the kit's plastic items. I didn't think that would be really that strong. So what I managed to do is laminate them onto the original kit parts and then get those to fit, but they did need some trimming, and as you can probably see, they are considerably bigger than the kit supplied items. Was it worth the effort with the colour match being off? Probably not. So going back to our assembly sequence in the instruction booklet, we've got the cockpit tub together. And my thoughts with this photo etch, with the consoles being so much wider than the kit, was I'm going to have to assemble and add the ejector seats to the model prior to adding the head-hard etched side consoles, just to make sure the seats would fit. And also by adding the seats, it would mean that I'm not going to ping the photo etch off if it's a bit tight in there. So the seats have been made up as suggested in the kit, and they do look quite detailed units. However, the fit into the cockpit tub was a little bit suspect, so what I've done is I've cut away the internal structure of the bottom of the seat, and that just allows it to drop straight in. So before we go any further and we join these fuselage halves together, we just need to assemble the exhaust and jet pipe. I've added the nose gear bay into the front of the fuselage. It does require nose weight, so we'll add some of that. We've got the intake on the front of the nose to be added as a separate part. We've got the rudder and the vent for the top aperture on the fuselage spine. Overall, the fit of the fuselage, just doing a quick test fit, was found to be really good, and the fit of this panel fits quite nicely as well. We just might need to do some work on this seam here. So we're just gluing the exhaust pipe itself, or the jet pipe, to the bulkhead, and then we're going to try this in situ just to appraise the fit, which all looks quite snug and that, and indeed it all fits in quite nicely, leaving us that jet pipe extruding from the rear end, which can be painted at the end of the build sequence. We're not really going to see that much in there, so we shall glue that in place, just making sure we get everything lined up. And what I'll do is I'll just stick some glue, as you've just seen, on one side of the fuselage bulkhead, and then we'll just tape it up and let it dry. And what that does is it just makes sure everything in there is in perfect alignment. So work's progressing well with the Hawk, and we've got to the point of the build where we do actually start needing to think about joining the wings to the fuselage. So I'm just going to flick this panel back out. It has just sunk in. So what I found when dry fitting the wing was that it doesn't fit very well. So we've just spent a few minutes with a sanding stick just sanding down the mating surfaces until we do actually get quite a good level join with the intakes. And at the back end it should just push in. So we're going to need a little bit of super glue, I think, just to hold everything where my fingers are, just in this area, and get everything lined up with the intakes so that we haven't got too bad a joint to deal with. And then what we're going to do is, I've only glued the wing leading edge to within a short distance of the fuselage and the wing root, and what this is going to enable us to do is just tweak the fit of the wing so that it does fit. So the first job we've got to do is to just put in the insert for the roof of the main gear bay, and it does sit low, as you can see there. So the fit is not generally brilliant. It is going to affect the fit of the undercarriage if you don't get it straight and level. However, what you will notice is when you do put in the wing section, any discrepancy is quickly hidden. So we'll glue that in place. I'm just going to try and get it a little bit better fit than that, just by getting it to sit flush with the aperture, but more importantly it does need to be level. So sometimes it's better to just go with what you've got, and it is resting on those pins, and at least we know it's level. So we're just going to put some Tamiya extra thin in there. At least we know that the model will sit on its undercarriage and be level, rather than have one side at a slight angle and not pushed down properly, because that's going to be a bit of a pain to say the least. So we'll just let that set. We need to add the ventral strakes and the speed brake bay, and that's a single insert. The fit's not bad, it's not brilliant, it just about sums Italeri up, I think. So we'll just add that. And again, we'll just wait for that to dry. While we're waiting for that to dry, we can set about adding the wingtip. So we've added the internal part of the undercarriage bay. There's two bulkheads there that make that up. So this will now just fit in like so. It is tight. And like we said, once we can got a bit of wiggle room and we can get that in alignment, perhaps just glue that back end in first. And so we're always thinking about what we can do to improve the fit of the parts we've got. And as you can see, the rear fuselage joint is really good. So what I'll probably do is use some super glue just to secure that, tape it up so it won't move or stress the bond, and then we'll work at getting this front section all lined up and blended in, and then we'll close the gaps on the wing roots. We can use the old trick of slightly putting a bit of pressure, upward pressure on the wingtips just to close the gap, but probably we're going to need a smidgen of filler in there. So we're just going to join the wings to our Hawk. I think my nose weight has just come loose. So we put some super glue onto this mating surface, and this is the one that we're going to be working on to make sure that everything does line up. And once we've got that in perfect position, we're just going to hold it there while the super glue bites. So I've just worked some Tamiya filler into those leading edge gaps. There we go, Tamiya putty. And the undersurface seam, and we're just going to set that aside to dry. I'll just remove this from the workbench before I stick my arm in it. So work's carried on with the Hawk. We've got the tail planes on. The fit's not the best, but it's adequate. We've got some Mr. Surfacer into those wing roots on the starboard side just to close the gap up a little bit. And I've added a blob of surfacer into each of those sink marks. So we'll polish that out in the next section. And I've added a bit of Mr. Surfacer round that ventral speed brake recess, and we've worked on this section of the fuselage. So in part 2 of our Hawk build, we'll focus on getting the model ready for primer and dealing with some of these joints and making sure everything's up to scratch before we do put that primer on. And then we'll hopefully look at applying a gloss black finish. So until next time, please look after yourselves, stay well and take care.